Hello and welcome to this conversation with Janelle Lamoreaux, Assistant Professor in Sociocultural Anthropology at the University of Arizona. I'm Katie Adele, Senior Research Associate at the University of Cambridge, a Visiting Scholar at the University of Copenhagen and Deputy Director of the Reproductive Sociology Research Group, or Reprosoc. I'm also working on the Changing Infertilities project funded by the Wellcome Trust and lead the work package on reproduction and environmental issues called Infertile Environments. Janelle completed her PhD in medical anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley in San Francisco. Her work focuses on reproduction, kinship, gender and environmental health, and she combines approaches from medical and cultural anthropology, feminist science studies and environmental humanities. Her new book, discussing her research on toxicologists in China, is out towards the end of this year, titled Infertile Environments, Epigenetic Toxicology and Reproductive Health of Chinese Men. Janelle has also published in cultural anthropology, environmental history and cross currents, amongst others. I had the great pleasure of working with Janelle for a couple of years while she was also a postdoc in Reprosoc, where we shared and developed our interests in how reproductive and environmental concerns intersect in people's lived experiences, multi-species ethnography and the art of ethnographic writing, as well as going whale watching in Iceland, on a writing retreat on the Suffolk coast, many business meetings in a Sicilian cafe near our shared office in Cambridge. We've also worked together on the project Reproducing the Environment and on a co-authored essay in Environmental Humanities, which discusses the so-called population problem in relation to the edited collection by Adele, Clarke and Donna Haraway, Making Kin Not Population, as well as Michelle Murphy's book, The Economization of Life, and Jade Sasser's ethnography on infertile ground. Janelle also recently co-edited a special issue of Medical Anthropology Quarterly on intergenerational ethnography with Sahra Gibbon, which has articles by both of us included as well. Janelle, welcome and thank you for sharing your work and ideas with us today. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you once again. So maybe we can start by you, but at the beginning really, with you telling us about your research in China, which you discuss in your forthcoming book. So can you summarise what you're interested in understanding in that research and some of the key themes and arguments of the book?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, first of all, Katie. It's always good to talk to you. So when I started my research in China, I was really interested in questions of infertility and the use of reproductive technologies in China. However, as I started spending more and more time with people there, I realized that questions of the causality were central to many concerns about infertility. And so rather than focus my study on the treatment of infertility through reproductive technologies or other techniques, I decided to shift focus and really think through how people were making sense of the causes of infertility. And a lot of that causality had to do with factors that exceeded the body. They were not necessarily separate from the body, but in addition to being embodied, they were also in environments that surrounded the body. And so I found a group of toxicologists who were really thinking through these questions in depth through a variety of different types of studies, both human and non-human. And so I was able to conduct an ethnography of a epigenetic toxicology lab that was working on questions of the causes of male infertility in particular. So once I sort of focused in on that research site, I got to expand again from there and think about how, narratives of infertility sort of circulated more broadly in media, in hospital settings, as well as inside the laboratory itself. And I started focusing on the ways that people were imagining what the environment was and how it got into their bodies and came out again through infertility. So the environment became this really important lens through which to think about infertility in China at that moment. So that was my central focus in the dissertation. And then I've turned that into a book. And the book more broadly thinks about endocrine disrupting chemicals of a wide variety and thinks about questions of gender, the racialization of Chinese men through infertility research, as well as what it means to live in China in a moment when there's growing attention to environmental problems, but not necessarily the type of environmental regulation that the toxicologists I was working with were after. So my research was conducted in 2011, so obviously a lot has changed since then, but the book sort of thinks through this moment in this moment of toxicology in China and what it meant to study infertility then.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because it is striking how many of the themes that you started looking at over a decade ago have only become more pertinent with time. And I guess that's true in general, but also particularly with China. And, you know, I know that there are some sort of strong themes there of grappling with the very low fertility rates after decades of managing population in a very stringent way, or increasingly less stringent, I suppose. The high demand for assisted reproduction there, and as you mentioned, concerns about the effects of pollution, and I guess probably increasingly climate change as well. As you know, the Changing Infertilities project is very much about changes in perceptions and behaviours around fertility and infertility, and I was just wondering what your reflections are on how that change is manifested in China in particular over the last sort of 10, 15 years.
Yeah, it's hard to say because I haven't been doing regular research in China since my dissertation, but I would point to those, at least two of those factors that you bring up, which is the shift in the regulation of reproduction as well as the regulation of pollution. So there's been a lot of attention brought to environmental problems, both in really abstract and really specific ways. So changes in chemical policies, for instance, or in requirements for factories and things like that. But also just the dialogue surrounding the environment and the relationship between the environment and infertility, especially sperm quality, has really exploded since I did my research. So it was definitely there when I was in China, but it's only grown since. And I think it's part of what some scholars refer to as the environmental consciousness in China, the growing environmental consciousness. So some of that is like crafted through state policies, but other dimensions of it are just, you know, broad concern about pollution and the recognition of the effects of pollution, not only on reproductive health, but also developmental health. And I think the rise of concern about developmental health has really been reflected in the growth of birth cohort studies in China, which have taken off in the last 10 years. So you have more and more toxicologists and other experts wanting to understand the intergenerational effects of toxic exposure in a way that goes beyond just fertility and thinks about the developmental factors as well. So I think, like you said, yeah, my research turned out to be more pertinent than I even thought it would at the time because of the growing awareness of environmental problems and then the growing interest in the intergenerational effects, which come through in epigenetic research, but is even more present in the birth cohort studies.
Yeah, I mean, I remember us going to watch a screening of Under the Dome, that film about the air pollution, and which was really fascinating. And I guess I'm not sure when that came out, but it was a while ago now, and it seems quite prescient in many ways. But I think one of the things that's really nice and distinctive about your work, and which maybe isn't entirely clear from the subtitle of your book, is that you look at both men and women's reproductive health, lives and identities, and even, you know, health more generally, as you indicate. So, and obviously gender is a really important aspect of your work, which you've talked about in relation to epigenetics and EDCs, as you mentioned, but also about food. And I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more about how gender and personhood, specifically in China, kind of feature in your work, and how they're made and reproduced in toxicological research in China in particular.
Yeah. So I did start this project wanting to sort of shift focus away from women and think about men and infertility, because so much of the important reproductive research that had come before me had focused primarily on women's experiences with ARTs and with infertility. So I did intentionally sort of want to move the lens, but obviously when you move the lens, you're not like getting rid of the women in the question, you're just adding to it and hopefully making it a more complex picture. So I do talk about, especially when I'm talking about epigenetics in the later chapters of the book, I do think about the maternal environment and the way that the maternal environment not only puts more pressure on women, but also implicates men, and how thinking about the gender of epigenetics is a really important question, because when we talk about intergenerational effects of exposure, we often think about the ways that this implicates women and makes them more susceptible to the blame for these problems, which is certainly true. But the question of how men are wrapped up in that intergenerationality is also really important, and the way that that sperm gets overlooked as a potential vehicle for epigenetic problems is a part of that gendered focus. And so the researchers that I studied were really trying to take seriously the question of the potential genotoxicity of chemicals to sperm, and the way that men and their reproductive substances are also harmed by chemical exposures, and how they might also be blamed isn't the right word, but sperm might also be a vehicle through which we should look at toxicity, or the transmission of toxicity. So that's one way I'm thinking about gender, and also just trying to contextualize this research a bit more in terms of like endocrine disrupting chemicals and the way that the transformation of men's bodies in particular becomes a site of concern when you're discussing endocrine disrupting chemicals, because people are so concerned about feminization, and not like, although there is concern obviously about women's bodies and premature puberty and things like that, EDCs and soy exposure in particular is often discussed through this lens of feminization. So that becomes really important in China, because there's this longer transnational history of imagining Asian bodies and Asian men's bodies in particular as more feminine. And so how questions of masculinity and nationhood get wrapped up in these studies of EDCs is really interesting. So how can we think about these broader stereotypes that have circulated for decades, and the ways that those stereotypes actually make their way into scientific research, both in China and outside of China in sites like the US. So I have one particular chapter called The Dietary Environment that thinks about soy and studies of soy as wrapped up in processes of both gendering and racializing populations.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I guess that also relates to your earlier article, What if the Environment is a Person, where you talk about the ideas about maternal responsibility and how they play out in epidemiological research, epigenetic research. But you make the point that we can't necessarily assume that the same kinds of ideas about gender, kinship, sexuality, and so on, that tend to get reproduced in a lot of the kind of, as you say, panic around endocrine disrupting chemicals is the same in China. And you talk about how the kind of maternal body or the maternal figure is also a deeply relational one. And that relates also to this kind of recurring motif in your work of the concentric circles, which I know is also, sort of typically Chinese idea. So have you kind of continued with that concentric circles idea and how you've structured the book.
It's funny. It's definitely there in the background, though I don't bring it out explicitly. And that is taken from Fei Xiaotong's work, who wrote about how when you throw a stone into a body of water, there are concentric circles that emerge from that stone. But the thing that I liked most about that image is that those circles themselves are moving, they're not stagnant. And so you have these contextual realms, which I'm thinking of in the book as environments. And there's all these environments that come into being through epigenetic research at different scales, but those scales are constantly moving and intersecting. They're not just like stagnant contexts that shape how research is done. So when I organized the book, each chapter is a separate environment, but it's not like those environments are just rings on a concentric circle that go from large to small. They're actually spheres which research moves through at various moments, and they can't really exist without each other, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So the concentric circle image is really helpful for me, especially when it has a little bit of fluidity to it.
That's really nice, yeah, and that's really important kind of contextualization, because I guess it's also showing how it's about the relationship between the stone and the water, and anything that comes in between. Yeah. Yes. So, you know, we're obviously both like to think about environments quite broadly, as you've just indicated, but I guess maybe we can talk a little bit more about specifically intersections between the environment in terms of environmental crisis and so on, and reproduction, and why. I realised I'd never asked you this, what sort of how and why you became interested in it in the first place, and I guess why you think it's an important area for anthropological research, reproductive studies, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of those scholars that was first studying gender and reproduction and then moved into thinking about the environment. And the reason I did that is because that's where the research really took me. You know, thinking about epigenetics, it became impossible not to think about the environment. And so as soon as I realized that epigenetics was the sort of toxicological method that I was most interested in, thinking about the reproductive body as something that's always operating within multiple environments just became essential to my studies. And then I had to do a lot of catch up thinking, you know, learning about environmental anthropology, something that I'm still continuing to do today. But yeah, and then being in China, also doing field work at a moment when I was constantly noticing the pollution that existed there. Partially because of my own body, because I have asthma, and that was something that I experienced in China, but also just because it was something that kept coming up in conversations in different ways. Not in a heavy-handed sense at all, but just it was the terminology that I found was taking me into the lab and then back out again. There were all these ways that things I was interested in the lab would come out in environmental conversations in different settings. So I'm thinking specifically, like I was visiting with this philosophy department that had a science and technology studies section, and their theme for that, the year that I was there, was the environment. And so I was talking to some activists in the group, and they were thinking about chemicals. So there were all these intersections, and it wasn't something that I thought I would do when I first got there, but it just became more and more obvious that that was what people were thinking about when I was there. So for me, it's been a way to really consider how reproduction is influenced by so many things that stand outside of it. And that's what's been really helpful. It's like I can use the environment to think about economics, to think about industrialization, to think about gender. There's just so many things that I can think about through the environment. And that sort of method echoes the method of the toxicologist I studied, which is something I also like.
Yeah, and I think it's for me as well, it's just a really important way of countering some of the assumptions about the narrowness of reproduction and where it's located. like you say, questions of causality, which I think are often massively overlooked, you know, particularly if you focus on assisted reproductive technologies, they're so sort of solution, as it were, oriented. And obviously that's to do with, you know, the industry that's grown up around it and so on, as well as, you know, why people go into it. But I think having a sense of perspective of what those environments are around reproduction is so important. And I think that comes out really clearly in your work.
Yeah, and I mean, it didn't hurt that when I was writing my book, I was in conversation with you, and your work, you know, foregrounds environmental consciousness and like the way people think about the environment in relation to reproduction, even if it's something they're not actively pursuing. So I think that intervention allowed me to really like take the making babies part of reproduction and like set it to the side and think about reproduction as this broader way of relating to the world, and a way of making sense of the world around you and what it is that you want to continue in that world. So infertility, you know, it feels like there's so much at stake, because if you can't reproduce, then a part of you can't go on. And I think that is just so echoed in environmental discourse. The stakes of the loss that might be experienced is very similar. So infertility works so well in both reproduction and environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you mentioned the making babies thing. So thinking about our co-authored essay, which responded to the call for greater attention to human reproduction and population growth in Donna, Haraway and Adele Clarke's work, I was wondering how much you think working in China has shaped your perspective on calls like this to limit the human population in favour of the environment and other species.
That's a good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, when you're a scholar of reproduction whose research is based on China, I think there is a there is a need to really reckon with the way policies shape bodies, reproductive bodies in particular. And simultaneously, for me, I didn't want to just focus on that dimension, the governance question, right? Or the state, the Chinese state. That wasn't the major site of interest to me. But it's definitely changed how I think about the way people experience infertility. So I think experiencing infertility at a moment when you're being told that you can only have one child and that pressure is heightened, it might be something different than it is to experience infertility today. And not saying that either is harder or more difficult, but that it's a different sort of pressure, and there's a different rendering of causality even when you have these high stakes, like you did with the reproductive policies that came before those that exist today. I don't know, really. I mean, that's a really hard question. It's hard to like bracket my China experience and the way I think about reproduction from my experience living in the US as someone who's constantly thinking about reproductive governance here, right? And the ways that abortion laws in particular are constantly being brought up and challenged in various states. And so, yeah, for me, the governance question was never just like about China. It was always about more than that as well. So I don't think I have a very sufficient answer for that question.
No, it's very interesting. But I mean, I think what comes out in what you've said, and which I kind of already know from the conversations we've had and the conversations we had when we were writing that essay, is that I think the key difference is a focus on lived experience of whatever kind. And so, as you say, it's less about governance, which of course is also quite a cliched way to approach China and reproductive policy anyway. That's kind of been done. But to think about not only lived experience of people who are experiencing infertility, which is obviously very important, and especially perhaps in areas where it's sort of surprising to an outsider.
Right.
But also, as you say, to look at scientists and how they're thinking about it, you know, fills in some of that kind of middle level. Again, questions of causality, but also just how people come to understand and articulate the environments in which they are living and the things that they are observing and experiencing in their lives, because of course scientists obviously have lived experiences too in conversations with people. I mean, of course, Donna Haraway and Adele Clarke are, you know, also massively influential, and with very good reason, in the fields in which we work. And I think it's fair to say that we both, you know, appreciate the enormous contributions they've made.
For sure.
If we depart from the make kin, not babies. Part. I was just wondering how you feel about your own position in I mean, I guess we're also both interdisciplinary scholars, and you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, work between reproductive studies, environmental studies, environmental anthropology, feminist science studies, sociology. So I guess also sort of thinking back to kind of when you started and where you are now, where you place yourself, and also given that you're so interested in questions of generations and intergenerationality, how you think questions of generation play out in academia today. And maybe if you have any advice for new scholars just starting out, that would be really interesting to hear.
I continue to position myself as a interdisciplinary scholar, even though that term is you know, means nothing and everything. But you know, I think my time at ReproSoc was so helpful because it brought together people from all these different disciplinary perspectives. And who were all asking questions about reproduction. And I think what that does is it just opens up your own work to a more generous reading of like every term you can imagine, like environment or gender or whatever. It just opens up everything to a multitude of approaches, right? Like you could approach these questions so differently and the results would still be super meaningful. And that's what I really like about interdisciplinary conversations, is just how it broadens your imagination in terms of your approach to different kinds of questions. So I still hold on to like being an STS scholar, obviously, because my anthropological research focuses on scientists. So I still hold on to that. I still see myself as a gender and reproduction scholar. And then, you know, in my job here at U of A, I'm often pulled in as the environmental anthropologist, even though I always feel insufficiently trained for that title. But so I think that it's worth being somewhat in between domains, because then you get a lot from all of these different spaces. So I've been organizing science and technology studies events here at U of A, and that's been just really helpful for getting me motivated again to do research, because I see all these different people that are excited about different things in different ways. So building community, at least to me, happens easier in interdisciplinary spaces. And then as far as the intergenerational dimension, it's something that I didn't think a lot about in the book that I wanted to think about more, which is why I entered into this discussion and an eventual edited collection with Sahra Gibbon, because we were just both really preoccupied by this question of intergenerationality. And I think, for me, it's again one of those terms that has specific meanings when you think about anthropology and kinship studies, but then the way that kinship is being taken up in environmental conversations is so interesting. So to be able to have both of those perspectives on intergenerationality, the deep like anthropological training where I think of kinship studies as like, kinship charts. And then I have the like more creative rendering of kinship from humanities scholars and others who are interested in environmental questions. So that's why the kinship question continues to be really interesting to me, because it's being taken up in all these ways that I think are surprising for anthropologists.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that we've both observed as well over the last few years, is how, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's fair to say that for both of us, when we started out looking at how reproduction and environmental concerns and experiences intersect, that was a bit of a out there thing to do. Yeah. Even though for both of us it's what emerged from our empirical research,
right.
Funny enough. And then in recent years it's suddenly become this almost common sense connection, which is really, really interesting. I mean, it's quite sort of validating as well, of course, but it's just really interesting also how that conversation has been not only in academia, but also, and maybe even more so, in public discourse.
Yeah.
So it's in all those conversations that people seem to be having about, whether I should have children given the way the future looks with the climate crisis. And I wonder also if, going back to what you said about feeling like a bit of an imposter as an environmental anthropologist, which I can definitely relate to, probably for anthropology and other disciplines, everyone's going to have to be an environmental one in one way or another. So it's going to be interesting and to see how that plays out, though obviously possibly for quite horrendous reasons. But on a more positive note, so I mentioned the writing retreat that you organised while you were at Cambridge, and I remember us having several conversations about ethnographic writing while I was writing my book as well, and definitely the conversations I had with you were really so helpful and informative for that as well. I particularly remember you recommending Hugh Raffles' book In Amazonia to me, which I still think is so beautifully written. So I was just wondering, given that your book is now coming out, how you sort of feel about ethnographic writing and ethnography as a form of writing as well as a type of research method, and how you put that into practice in writing your own book.
So I always have loved writing since I was little, and it's actually what led me to want to be an anthropologist, because I saw that it was the social science that gave the most space for creative writing or creativity, and I wanted to write creative nonfiction, and so I thought that was the best vehicle to do that through. But then, I became a graduate student and realized I had to publish articles and now a book. And so the creativity part of it, sometimes it falls off when you start dealing with the demands of a job. So for the book, a lot of it doesn't, I hope that it's all written well, and I really tried to make it a readable text that people could sink their teeth into, even if they weren't experts in the subject. But the spaces in the book where I feel like my most writerly self are the beginning and the end, the preface and the epilogue. And those are spaces where I bring my own experience as an academic or as a mother into the conversation. So I think going forward, I would really like to explore those types of writing more, where I am more central, and it's not necessarily different than ethnography, but it's different than the ethnography that I wrote about scientists working in China. I just didn't feel like I wanted to put myself front and center in those middle chapters. Instead, I really wanted to try to bring across the way other people were thinking about a problem and sort of analyze it from that perspective. But I allowed myself more of a voice in the preface and epilogue, and those ended up being my favorite parts. And I think there are a few readers' favorite parts too. So there's something to be said about like when you actually think you're enjoying your writing, it might be better. But yeah, I just love the writing process, and like organizing that writing retreat was definitely one of the highlights of my time at Cambridge. And I'd like to do more of those in the future. It was just so fun. And I think it was productive for everyone, not necessarily in the sense that we got a lot done, but we explored different ways of thinking about the problems that we were writing about. And it was a good time to get to know each other in a different way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it also reflects the way that, unfortunately, writing is so often, especially when you have a teaching position, that thing you have to do on the side, even though it's also supposed to be the most important thing you're doing in many ways, or one of the most important things in terms of career progression and job security and so on. You know, yeah, it's always one of those things where people mention a writing retreat and eyes light up, and it's sort of like, wow, that would be so great. It's never going to happen. Seems to so often be the case. I was just wondering actually if there are any ethnographies that you've read recently that you particularly enjoyed or would recommend.
You know, this is like the part where I go into the shame circle, because I really haven't been reading that much beyond the work that I'm teaching right now. So I'm teaching a graduate seminar on the history of anthropological theory, which is very reading heavy. So I've been revisiting some classics that I really enjoyed. We read Partial Connections by Marilyn Strathern, which to me is just like an amazing text that I'll need to read a number more times before I can really understand. But that was a really inspiring read. And then last week we read The Body Multiple by Anne Marie Mulligan, which is a text that I really, really liked in graduate school. So it was fun to revisit that and see what it opened up for graduate students. But I have a list of like 10 ethnographies that I'm really excited to read when I go on my sabbatical starting in just a few weeks.
Yeah, well, no, there's nothing wrong with revisiting classics, and
No.
Nice to have the opportunity to do so as well, because so often we end up reading things, you know, with a specific purpose, you know, oh, I need to read this for this article I'm writing, or,
Yes,
or whatever. So that's really nice to revisit.
Yeah, a lot of the texts that I'm excited about reading are like the genre of memoir / ethnography that's becoming increasingly popular, because I'm thinking about doing something like that for a next project. So yeah, I have like a list of either memoirs from like a non-academic perspective or memoir / ethnography that I'm hoping to read soon.
That sounds fun.
Yeah.
And that actually kind of leads on to my last question, which is about where you're thinking about taking your research next, now that your book is coming out. Would you like to share any of the sort of themes or ideas or potential field sites that you'd like to explore for your next big project?
Yeah, I have a few imaginary projects, all of which I've done some writing with in some way or another, but none of which I've committed to. So I have one which you're most familiar with, which is about not just seed banking, which is something I know you've been working on for a while, or at least seed saving you've been working on, but the idea that we need to save the diversity of all species, not just a certain species, in order to prepare for the unknown that's coming and bank life in order to preserve it, basically. So I've been thinking about doing some research on coral experts who bank coral egg and sperm, because coral actually have egg and sperm. But I've also been thinking about broadening that to look at a specific group who's actually doing research here at the University of Arizona. They're trying to plan what they call a lunar ark, which will be a contraption that holds the widest variety of germ cells from many species as possible and stores them in a cave on the moon. So this is a project that's received quite a bit of funding for, preliminary investigation, and they're trying to figure out how this might be possible. So I guess in that project, I'm really thinking about what this apocalyptic imaginary that we have makes possible.
Yeah.
So what sort of things get funded through this apocalyptic imaginary? How much work is being done in the name of an unknown future that is full of devastation? And where does life and the idea of preserving life fit into that? And how do germ cells factor into it? So that's one project that I've been thinking about doing. And that would be more like the first project in the sense that it would be a study of scientists and the way that they think about a problem, but maybe not as focused on causes as solutions, as you said earlier. Yeah. So the second project is a more personal one. It has to do with sensory processing disorder, which is more of a medical anthropology project, I think, but also has to do with reproduction and developmental health. So my son has been diagnosed with sensory processing disorder, and that's a condition in which you can basically react differently than neurotypical people to sensory input. So you could smell something and it could smell really, really bad or really, really good, or you could get really, really dizzy when you spin around in a circle when most kids would be able to spin really fast. Just all of these different kinds of sensory input and the way your body reacts to them. So there's been a lot of discussion about how different types of toxic exposures might cause these sensory conditions. And so I've been thinking about perhaps doing something that's related to the diagnosis of sensory conditions and how different people diagnose and treat sensory disorder, how we came up with the diagnosis in the first place. So I've done some archival research at University of Southern California with the archives of the woman, Jean Ayres, who came up with this diagnosis in the first place. And then, I've been thinking about and experiencing treatment for this condition in various ways. So how, basically the question would be, how do these neurological differences that are becoming increasingly common and that we have an increasing awareness of, at least, if not, the facts to state that it's increasingly common, how are they articulated through concern about toxic exposure in environments? So thinking about different types of environments, again, the way a classroom environment or a household environment or an urban environment or a polluted environment sort of set people up for a condition that is a difference, a neurological difference, and the ways that different actors in people's lives, teachers, pediatricians, therapists, parents, think about causality in terms of neurological difference. And I think it's especially important because, this difference isn't necessarily negative. It's different, but it's not necessarily a disorder. At least I don't think so. So how do we think about causality without saying that something is bad? How do we think about causality outside of the positive and negative sort of dichotomy? There's a lot there, and it's a very personal project, so I don't know if I'll be able to do it, but it's something that interests me, and I think there's space for it in all this concern about the developmental origins of health and disease and epigenetics and the way, neurological differences being increasingly addressed in different circles. So there's something there, but I'm not sure exactly what form it would take or if I want to go into it. And then I also have a third idea, but I'm not going to talk about it today.
A secret idea. That's good.
Not a secret, but not developed enough to articulate in any way, considering I can barely articulate the last.
It is both really fascinating and as you say, quite different ends of, you know, the spectrum in terms of where they're located, literally and metaphorically.
Right.
But also, again, I suppose, questions of causality and solutions and difference and disaster and all those sorts of things. And it sounds like the second one would have many parallels with some of the work that you mentioned earlier about endocrine disrupting chemicals and how those are portrayed, and the point you make in your work about how, like you're saying, you know, difference isn't necessarily good or bad, but also how the ways that people do think and experience life and the world differently can also be ways in to critique the broader environments in which people are, you know, have to live, because that's the thing about a toxic environment, there's no escaping it.
Right.
Then kind of has a funny sort of manifestation in ideas about space.
Yes.
As a sort of escape route or an escape destination, I suppose, in some ways.
Yes. And I'm really fascinated by that idea that we can buy ourselves out of this problem through this sort of technological fix. Whereas that doesn't seem as reasonable for those of us living on Earth who are trying to make our way through the world with differences.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the tragedy about the space stuff, apart from the massive stratification and inequality that would undoubtedly go with it, which is pretty tragic in itself, is the way that it's sort of an admission of failure. It's an admission of failure, really. It's you know, it's very hopeless, or it's displacing hope elsewhere. Maybe that's a slightly more hopeful way of looking at it. But yeah, as you say, it's extremely apocalyptic. But how interesting that it's germ cells that come out, and once again, reproduction is so closely associated with the future. And I think really interestingly, also going back to thinking about seed banking and seed saving, these ideas of salvation, saving in the form of banking, also as a form of salvation for humanity, the future, particular species, the world, etc., is really, really interesting, and in a way also again points to the dominance of sort of Western narratives of all these things that we've been talking about, reproduction,
totally.
time, the future, and so on, because of course about salvation is such a Judeo-Christian idea as well.
I've been thinking, revisiting Risa Cromer's work on embryo banking and the ways, and embryo adoption and the discourses of salvation that are present there. But yeah, I think the thing that comes back to me with these, with this really dismal hopefulness being encapsulated by these germ cells, is that reproduction again gets decontextualized, embodied, right, in these specific or cells, right, in these ideas of what life is. And the whole, all of the findings that we have from epigenetic research and other kinds of contextualizing scientific research, that reproduction is not about cells, it's about environments that surround these things and the interaction between things and the processes, it all gets lost. And we think that we fund research that says we're going to save ourselves by saving cells, not thinking about the context that these cells will then need in the future, or the other entities that they'll need to relate to as they mature in the future. It just gets lost in these salvation projects.
Yeah, it's sort of like cellular reproduction or something.
Yeah.
And it makes me think also with the difference between in situ and ex situ, seed saving, seed banking, and the ideas that go with that about how whether it's desirable to separate organisms or germ cells from their environments, and actually how that maps onto different ideas of saving. So I think with my research with in situ seed savers, it's not so much, or really at all, certainly with the people I've been working with, about salvation. I mean, it's a practice that people are interested in as part of feeling that the climate crisis is very real and very urgent, and this is one thing they can do. But it's not really about that kind of that salvation narrative. It's or even about banking for the future in the sense of banking and investment and all those kinds of metaphors. It's more about literally saving something that you have so you can reuse it. It's more of a sort of recycling, I suppose, or regenerative kind of way of thinking, which again is coming back to generations and maybe cycles, which goes with this sort of agricultural, seasonal kind of thinking as well, as opposed to this sort of linear generation after generation after generation, and that is how time and future is made kind of idea. Well, thank you so much. It's been really fascinating as ever talking to you.
Thank you, Katie. I miss our hot chocolate.
Yeah, I know, me too.